Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. As always, we're brought to you by you through support on Patron.com. Today I'm joined again by Joshua Yen. He runs the Apologetics for All YouTube channel, and we're going to be talking about Apostate Prophet's case against God's existence. So we'll be going through that. But Josh, welcome. How are you doing, man?
Thank you. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good, man. It's fun to talk with you, and it's going to be fun to talk about Apostate Prophet's argument. So I have his opening statement pulled up here in a second, so we'll pull it up on screen. We're just going to kind of walk through that, give our thoughts. I really enjoyed his opening statement because we were talking about it like beforehand, but it's very fresh. It's things that I don't usually hear in like arguments against the existence of God. So there's lots of great stuff here, and I really liked what AP's doing. Obviously, we disagree because we're theists, but there's a lot of fun stuff. But what do you think, Josh?
I definitely think it is a very interesting debate. There was a few times or parts of his opening statement where I wasn't really sure where to pin him exactly. Was he arguing for an atheistic standpoint? Was he arguing for relativism? And that was quite an interesting thing and an interesting approach, which normally, as you said, doesn't really appear too much in these atheist-theist debates. And it's kind of a breath of fresh air, I guess, to this scene. And it is definitely really good. It's going to be really fun to discuss it with you.
Yeah, that's great. It's going to be a lot of fun. And if you're listening, this will hopefully be more casual, so we'll be able to interact more if you have questions or things as we get going. But I'm going to pull up his opening statement and we're going to get started and we'll just see where we go. This is actually just a quick point to stop it off just very quickly. But I liked AP's approach here because I think a lot of times we get too focused in debates and just destroying the other guy, but it's really just about like exchanging ideas and finding truth, which is something we don't see enough in debates, but it's something I'm really glad to see. So
Yes.
Can you hear the audio, Josh, or not?
I don't think I can hear the audio right now. Let me check it on YouTube right now and see if I can
think
hear it on YouTube.
No, I think it's on my fault because I believe that I shared the screen and then I didn't share audio. So that's on me. So yeah, that's exactly. I didn't click the share audio box. Yep. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, Jacob Burbridge in the live chat for letting me know. So it should be good now. And if you don't hear it now, please let me know. So that's my fault. But basically Apostate Prophet just said thank you. And we're here to exchange ideas. So I apologize for that, but you should be able to hear it now.
The question that we're dealing with, the question that we're debating and that we're seeking an answer for is not a question that has a definite answer. It's not a question that we can thoroughly analyze and thereby obtain an observable, objective answer. It will always only be picked up by people and used and interpreted in different ways. Something that Mike says today or something that I say today might be taken and turned into completely different shapes. No matter what our position on the question, does God exist, is, we could assume all kinds of varieties of positions, back them up and to justify those positions with numerous arguments. And we could find suitable citations for every reasonable or absurd thing that we can present today, and then consider them proof. Whether I have the better answers today or Mike, they will simply be nothing but our answers, supported by our arguments, which we or our listeners consider strong because we are convinced or because we want to confirm that we are indeed right about our conclusions. I want to acknowledge that neither of us will be right today. We will only have shared our conclusions because that's what we like to do. We can't prove anything. Science will not prove anything for us. We cannot prove anything with science. All we can do is to draw conclusions from certain scientific observations, logic, psychological observations, history, anthropology, and so on. And then from those conclusions deduce that there must be or can be or can't be, or that there is no God. I want to make use today a little bit of science.
Right. So there's a lot of good stuff here. I think this is a good part to stop because there's a lot of interesting ideas here from AP. But what do you think, Josh, of kind of like this opening before he gets into his arguments?
Well, I definitely think that it is a very interesting way to put it. I think interesting is the best way to put it here. I wouldn't say I necessarily agree with it, but there's a few parts that I think we can pick off at the get-go. Like his first thing about no definite answer. Like the first time I hear that, I think we need to raise the question, is he arguing for relativism or not? And I think this entire relativism versus objective truth or objective reality is kind of seen as two opposite, how should I say it, antipodes or two opposite concepts in his entire debate. And I think it's seen in a few of his arguments later, but also mostly seen in his approach in this first place. And he also says, I think, that neither of us would be right. We're only defending our conclusions, which I think is quite a weird way to approach a debate about does God exist or not. Like it's kind of like saying, does God exist? And then says, well, neither the proposition God existing and God not existing is right at the same time. Like that would seem to me to like violate the law of the excluded middle, which says that either the truth of one proposition is right or the falsehood or the opposition of that truth is right. And actually, there are some mathematical approaches which do deny the law of excluded middle, but I do think that his uses of it here is quite, I wouldn't say worrying, but quite surprising, I guess. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's something I was going to say. Jacob in the chat just said that it sounded like postmodernism. Neither of us will be right. And I think if you asked AP, he would like affirm that, yes, either God exists or God does not exist. But I think if the point he's trying to make is we can't know with certainty either way. Like if Michael kind of has his reasons and I have my reasons for denying it. And people are just going to kind of believe whatever they kind of believe already. And they're just going to kind of go with confirmation bias in this debate. So I think it is kind of weary though with AP because it seems like he's like, we just don't know. Which, I mean, you don't know with like 100% Cartesian certainty, but like you can know a lot of things with a high degree of probability. So that's kind of my thought on that. It's an interesting idea. I think he's going like full on relativism, but it does seem like he's just kind of saying like we can't know either way.
Yeah, sounds like a good interpretation of AP's thing. It definitely is. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. He's probably, rather than arguing for relativism, which would seem to defeat his own point, it does seem that he's arguing more against like we don't have certainty here, which seems like a better way to look at it. I guess
it's almost like he's like saying that like we're kind of all agnostic and we lean different ways. It's almost what it sounds like. I don't think that exactly represents his view. That's kind of what I'm getting from it.
Yeah.
All right, we'll keep on going.
A little bit of history and a little bit of psychology to address those, to address the question with three different points in perspective. The first point would be that there is disorder and meaninglessness in the world as opposed to order and meaning. The second point would be that that God arises from the human attempt to explain natural functions and phenomena, which is an extension of the argument of the God of the apps. And thirdly, I would like to address this issue briefly in terms of the psychology of religion, the psychology of belief, or religious experience also. To come to the first point, that there is disorder, that we are surrounded by disorder. There is an age-old notion going on which dominates religious debates, which has always dominated religious debates, that there is a balance, that there is order, perfection, stability, that there is something intelligent in the world. But this couldn't be further from the truth. We are surrounded by chaos and meaninglessness. We don't exist within and because of order. We exist despite chaos, despite disorder. Our existence is no sign of order. On the contrary, our observations are evidence of disorder everywhere. We are on a planet that is not entirely stable. Natural disasters are everywhere. We are surrounded by cruel climates, destructive earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, floods, storms, unpredictable volcanoes, meteors. Our planet is constantly full of disorder. In its recorded history, it was hit by giant objects that caused vast groups of animals to go extinct forever and serve no purpose whatsoever. In our recorded history, we have numerous species that have gone extinct, including nearly or intelligent species. We have dealt with harsh climates and changes of our worlds. Inhabited lands have disappeared from the map within the last millennium. A flood known as the St. Marcellus flood, for example, or also known as the Great Drowning of Men, changed the map and created islands in Europe in the 14th century. That actually happened. It changed maps. The world changed within the last 2,000 years or 1,000 years. On top of that, we have lived in deserts, in freezing, cruel climates. We have adapted to different standards. Humans have waged meaningless wars and died in masses for no significant reason. If you look back at history, you see that people have died in so many conflicts in masses for seemingly no purpose, for things that were very important to them, but that carry no importance to us or to anybody anymore. We have just died like mindless animals. If aliens were observing us for the last 2,000 years, they would probably think, what the hell are these people doing? But they would probably not think that, just as when we look at the animals around us, many of which have gone extinct, we don't wonder why these people keep fighting and keep killing each other and surviving. We just observe that as something beautiful. We have documentaries about that stuff. We watch animals kill each other in the most brutal ways, senselessly, in the most cruel ways. To us, that's just how they are. And to them, all the curious things that we developed intelligent humans do, including slaughtering those animals for religious purposes, have no meaning at all. All those things have only meaning to us, not to them. It is entirely subjective. Departing from that, not to mention we have numerous diseases, different diseases, many of them originating from the fact that our human bodies randomly are incapable of functioning properly, even if you live a very healthy life. If we look at our solar system alone, we see that our Earth orbits the sun not in a perfect circle, contrary to popular belief and depictions, but rather in a quite irregular way. There is no perfect pattern to it. Scientists are not sure whether this orbit is stable or whether it will change in the future. Many of them figure that it will not stay stable. In our solar system, we have numerous objects that meaninglessly roam this system, causing trouble or just floating forever. Just recently, we have, again, begun talks about possible asteroids hitting the Earth in the next 100 or thousands of years, causing a danger of possibly destroying this planet and causing mass extinction. Many planets in the solar system exist beside our own and are only full of chaos, full of storms and lightnings. They can't be home to life. They serve no purpose at all. And some of them are even surrounded by numerous moons that have absolutely no meaning. For most of these objects, if they suddenly disappeared, including major planets around us, if they suddenly disappeared, nothing would change as far as we know. They would have no significant impact. Their disappearance would have no significant impact to the flow of things as they are. If we look outside of our solar system, our galaxy is full of rogue planets that float in the void forever because they were ejected or probably never orbited a stable star. And they just float into the nothingness, a state that we, our Earth, could also be thrown into, possibly, hypothetically. On top of that, the consensus among scientists is that if climate change affects our planet, we would not be wiped out anytime soon. We would simply adapt to a new way of living, maybe under harsher circumstances. So, long story short, there is disorder, there is chaos, there is meaninglessness everywhere around us, and we exist in the middle of it. And despite all of this chaos, not due to some order and some great meaning, not some perfect balance, some perfect flow of things. It is nice to believe that we exist for a reason and there is some great meaning and order, but looking at the cosmos as we see it now and observing that we are on one rare planet that is kind of suitable for life, not perfect for life, while most planets that we see and are not, and some planets might be, it is rather absurd to assert that there is order, that there is meaning, that there is some great, fantastic design behind all of this, because what we see is that most of what exists right now is meaningless and a failure. Moving on to this.
Right. There's a lot of great stuff here. I let it go for a little bit because I figured with Apostate Prophet, he gives like 3 arguments against the existence of God, or maybe like this would be just more expected under atheism and theism. So I figured we just go one section by section. There's a lot of points he made there, Josh. I kind of wrote some notes down and stuff. But, like, what do you think of this like general case from like argument from chaos?
Well, now that you've put the Apostate Prophet on 1.25 speed, I think he finally starts sounding or speaking as fast as Andrew Loke here. But I do think, but to be honest, I do think that the argument from chaos, I think it's very important that he kind of distinguishes, or that we distinguish between what is disorder and chaos. And wait, what did I just say? That we distinguish between disharmony and lack of life and chaos, because I think they're very two fundamentally different things, which I think he might be equivocating in his argument. Mm-hmm. Because maybe something doesn't produce life for us, or some things might not seem too orderly for us. But these same things which don't seem orderly, for example, what he says, I think a meteor hitting Earth or diseases, these are the results of, I think, what you did in your debate with Randolph, said, well, finely tuned cosmological constants and finely tuned systems around the world in our solar system, which are quite, by their definition, quite orderly. They follow mathematical principles. I wouldn't say they're mathematical themselves intrinsically, but you can use mathematical principles or equations given certain constants to describe most things in this universe, no matter how disharmonious they are with what we commonly conceive as life. So I think that there is as starters, I think it's very important for us to distinguish between the two and see that while some things may not be beneficial to human life, it doesn't mean that there's disorder or complete chaos. The universe is still very orderly. Before we came to be, before humans were here, and perhaps even after humans are here. So I think there's quite a big difference between harmony and order, or disharmony and chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of got like 5 sub-arguments out of this kind of like argument. And that was one of them where he just talks about like we're surrounded by chaos. And I think that just a little bit adding on to what you said, if you talk to a lot of like people who are experts in fine-tuning, we need this giant universe to have a planet like Earth. I'm not a scientist, but you need like the constants to act in a certain way, and they produce this big universe, and it provides this balance that allows the Earth to exist. And in a sense, I understand what he's saying with like the chaos of like asteroids can hit us and stuff. But at the same time, we live in a universe that's governed by laws of nature that are regular. The laws of gravity on Earth don't just disappear for no reason at random times. They're constant all the time. So I understand what he's saying, but I also would kind of think that there actually is order more fundamentally. Another kind of a second thing that I saw brought up was like the idea of like natural evils. Like he talked about mass extinctions and asteroids hitting and just all the seeming like unnecessary death. And obviously this gets like the problem of evil. And there's a lot of different like theodicies about like there's a lot of different directions you can take with like animal suffering, or like why is there tsunamis or things like that. But I just kind of wonder if natural evil really rules out the existence of God, because I don't think it does. I was reading in like the Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology, and it was talking about natural evil, and I think it was Edward Martin brought up this point where it's like, what are we expecting under theism? Like, are we expecting like no suffering at all? Or are we like, if there's some suffering in our world, it seems kind of like just weird to say, like, couldn't there just be like a little bit less? Like there could always just be a little bit less of suffering, I would think, unless we live in a perfect world. So I just don't really know if like the argument from natural evil really works. That's kind of a weird way of putting it. I hope that makes sense. But like, what do you think about that?
Well, I do think natural evil is a very interesting thing because it goes beyond the moral evil, and he also kind of hides it in as kind of a sub-argument, as you said. Instead of making it, I'm now arguing the problem of evil, he's kind of, let's throw it in and just add a bit more to my argument as a bit more punch. But I do think, and I've grown quite, I think Plantinga raises something called, and also Peckham raises something called cosmic conflict, which is the idea that natural evil is not just a result of, well, the laws of nature, but also the free will or the agency of divine beings or fallen angels kind of thing. And you may say that is quite absurd from face value, because why am I now saying that there's an entire galaxy or a host of angels fighting now? But I do think there is seemingly quite an interesting problem here, because, like the problem of evil is normally saying, well, given a theistic worldview, there's some problems with your theism here. Because if you say, well, given atheism, is the problem of evil powerful? I mean, if you want to hold to the idea that objective evil cannot exist without theism, then you have the problem, well, then the problem of evil just doesn't exist at all if you're saying on atheism. So there seemed to be some first assumption on theism for the problem, any problem of evil to work. And from that assumption of theism, you can think, well, what do we expect on theism? Do we have to expect that the only free agents are material, are physical, or can we also allow for other divine entities? And I don't mean divine by like godly, but divine as in like transcendent and metaphysical, kind of more metaphysical beings. And I do think that that's what we see in the biblical narrative and in most theistic religions, that God is not the only supernatural being there is. And hence my new favorite theodicy or response to natural evil is the idea that there exists these supernatural beings, I guess.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, if you get into the Genesis account, people, another idea is like, there's this like large period of time in between like verses 1 and verses 2, or it's 2 and 3 or 1 and 2, where it's like Satan kind of enters the world and the world comes into like a fallen state. The third argument that I kind of detected from this was like the idea of like moral evil and like human evil. Like he talks about like wars and famines and diseases where it kills all these people. And, there's a lot of different theodicies that you can kind of run through that are very common in this, like the free will defense or things like that. But something really interesting that I've thought about recently is a theodicy that I think it was developed by Vince Vitale, where it kind of talks about how like we're dependent on these like great evils, like wars and stuff, like for our own existence. So just to like play this out a little bit. So take, for example, myself. I exist as a product of my parents, obviously, and in my dad's side, his mother was married to a guy who is like in his early 20s, and he went to Vietnam for the Vietnam War, and he died in this war. And after his death, my grandmother meets my actual grandfather now, and then they have my dad, and my dad has me. And this theodicy basically is just kind of talking about like when we deal with like these massive evils, like are we really just in a position to say that that God wouldn't allow this? Because it seems like there could be like much greater goods. Not saying the universe like depends on me, but it would seem like even in these like massive catastrophes, like AP brings up like all the seemingly like meaningless wars in his opening statement, like there is some purpose that's kind of coming out of this, and we just aren't really in a position to know otherwise like what the result would be. There was no World War II, the 100 Years Wars, things like that. So it's an interesting kind of theodicy response that could be used against AP's kind of like statement he brought up about like significant like casualty of humanity. But what do you kind of think of that, Josh?
That's an interesting theodicy, and I definitely think it does work. And I think I like a bit of history myself and a bit of psychology, and I do think that wars definitely do play a very interesting role in the development of mankind. And you might think, well, war would not have led to the development of, well, without war, maybe humans would be another few thousand years in the future. But if you look at war and what it's caused humans to do, you realize that most major inventions are built to war around or surrounding military technology and military, and like they're like, okay, our troops are really far out, or like they're starving, or we can't get food to them. What do we produce? We produce some canned food, which preserves food more. So I definitely agree with you that a lot of suffering or a lot of these so-called problems are actually, or do indeed lead to better things in the future. And I definitely agree with your theodicy, and I do think it makes a lot of sense. And I think it would respond to AP's argument here quite well. And there's a note that I made, I think, which ties into another of his arguments about meaningless objects. And he's like, okay, everything is meaningless. And I don't want to make too much of a fuss about this, how everything is meaningless, but I do like to make a note here whenever I talk about meaningless in philosophy and stuff, is that there's a very clear or a very big difference. It's very easy, I think, for us, for people who do philosophy, to make arguments. And it's a bit more difficult for us to defend our arguments and defend our claims. Of course, it's easier to attack or defeat a belief than really defend a belief. But then what is most difficult, I think, for us philosophers is, well, do you live by your philosophy and what you're arguing? Because that's normally the most difficult thing anyone's ever done. I mean, like AP, it's all well and good. And I deeply respect him for coming out as one of the only atheists I've heard in a long time, just saying, well, everything's absolutely meaningless. And hopefully I'm not straw manning his belief here, but I mean, the sense and the idea that the entire universe is filled with disorder and meaningless, I think it would be quite a good inference, or at least a justified inference, to do believe that he thinks that most things are meaningless. And the problem with that is, well, where does that bring us? What society does that lead us to? And I'm not going to go on a huge thing, well, oh my gosh, without God, everyone's going to kill themselves. And I wouldn't necessarily take it that far, but the question is, do we really live by that? And does the act of us debating, our discussion, really bring us to that? Like, is he living out his philosophy via, like, from his arguments, and is he applying that to his life? And there's also some discussion there as well. So that's just something I want to point out about this meaningless argument. Although I do agree with him that if you're truly going to take everything if you're going to get rid of God, get rid of the supernatural side, and just leave it, the universe is it's all physical, it's very hard, I would say, to synthesize any notion of objective meaning. Subjective meaning is fine, but it's very difficult to ground objective meaning in life. And it's just, I think, it's almost an undeniable fact. And I think AP kind of agrees with that here as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like he's kind of willing to admit, like, like life is this just like happy accident almost. And, there may not be any ultimate meaning while we're here, but kind of make the best of like this experience while we have it. I think that's kind of what he would agree with, hopefully. And if you're listening to AP, you're awesome. We thank you for this. One last point I kind of got from his opening statement, and feel free to like share anything else you got from it, was he talked a little bit like within the beginning, he talked about like being in chaos, but he talked about there just being this giant universe. And then there's just this one planet that's kind of suitable for life. And you have like you and us. Obviously, I think our planet is suitable for life completely because, we exist. So obviously there's life. But then one thing with like the giant universe thing that IP brings up, I think it's in his first rebuttal, is so yeah, we do have this giant universe that's gazillions of light years huge. And what IP brings up is he's like, okay, well, in this life, yes, it's totally true that we kind of have this giant universe, and maybe it helps like sustain our Earth in a natural way, but it's just like we can't like explore all this universe, and it seems like it's dead. But he brings up, if we have like maybe it's like a gazillion years to the future, it's a very large number he brings up in his rebuttal of all this time. Who knows what we could do with like exploring and terraforming planets and all these things. So the universe, while it may seem so big and so hard to understand in this life, if we actually have like an infinite future in heaven, then it would make a lot more sense. So that's something in IP's rebuttal that I kind of got, which would kind of answer that his last kind of objection. So do you have any other thoughts?
I think that covers it pretty well. I do think that is quite a good response. And yeah, I think you've covered the position quite well, and it's all good.
You have any other thoughts on this kind of like first argument from an argument from chaos before we kind of get into a second argument against theism?
I think perhaps, just as something I could add here, is perhaps you could have, instead of having Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, I think you could create even more a powerful case by saying, well, perhaps let's have the universal argument against naturalism. If everything's so chaotic, if everything's so meaningless, if you change evolution here for a meaningless universe, does that not work in the same way as Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism? I don't want to go into depth here or discuss it too much, because that would just go completely beyond the scope of this discussion. But I do think that if on the assumption that instead of just random evolution, the entire universe is completely disordered and meaningless, I think that might provide an even more powerful defeater for any truth claim than evolution itself. So just throw it out there for any food for thought, I guess.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And in the Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology, it's really interesting. They talk a lot about like, how do we get moral realism of evolution with like just a purely natural evolution? But I guess that's a topic for another day, and we'll kind of look at AP's second argument right now.
To the second point, that we humans attempt to explain functions and phenomena with gods. It is easy to explain everything right now about the universe, the galaxy, and solar system, and all that. But this is all very new knowledge. Like 100 years ago, we didn't really know about the universe. The knowledge that we are in a giant universe with many galaxies emerged only 100 years ago. History will have explained so many things, so many functions in the natural world by using gods and divine origins. Trees, plants, wine, food, love, life, death, war, fate, lightning, water, light, wind, sky, moon, sun, and all these things. People had gods and divine origins and explanation for all of that. They saw a lightning, they heard a sound of thunder coming with it, and they thought, okay, this must be happening because there is a person, a god, a mind behind that. The issue is that all these things always turned out to be wrong until everything evolved into one god who is apparently behind everything and who is hard to perceive and to explain. But that is only relevant to us now in our conversation because of Christian and Islamic supremacy. If we went to India, for example, things would depend on the Hindu godhead, and they would have completely different explanations for all of this. Buddhists, a major culture, don't even believe in a divine origin and divine creator. In many other cultures, people have non-theistic beliefs. If we look at the history of humans trying to explain these things with divine origins, we see that nothing ever turned out to be supernatural. All those beliefs, all those assertions always turned out to be wrong. There is not a single example of something that we attributed to God and it turned out to be God. So 100 out of 100 guesses were wrong. So it is quite pointless to still dwell on that. Contemporary studies, for example, every time you understand something, religion becomes less likely. I think this very nicely captures, James Watt, scientist, I think very nicely captures how humans evolved to forget, to give up blaming everything and crediting God for everything. It is rather baffling that we still dwell on this age-old explanation and don't focus on exploring and understanding the space, the universe around us in a better way. But I understand that because humans want to believe. And here I want to come to the final point, which is the psychology of religion, the psychology of belief. I understand why people want to believe. Psychology understands why people want to believe. Believing in something makes life easier. It is hard for humans to accept the fact, the idea that life simply goes on without us, that after we die, we simply cease existing.
My apologies. I stopped that a second too late. I was taking notes. But his second argument, kind of just talking about, it's like more of like a God of the gaps kind of thing. That's the theistic arguments. Like, what do you think of that kind of idea, Josh?
Well, I guess we could first adapt or talk about the God of the gaps thing. I think what he's arguing here is like it's very easy to call God of the gaps and then say literally everything is God of the gaps. But sometimes what you so-called God of the gaps is actually quite good abductive reasoning. Like it would be absurd to suggest that, well, okay, let's grant the resurrection happened, for example, that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And then we say, well, God rose Jesus from the dead. And someone says, well, that's a God of the gaps argument. You're just throwing God in anywhere. I mean, I think that would be quite an extreme form of God of the gaps reasoning, or adherence to the God of the gaps principle, to say, well, literally everything I see or anywhere where I say God exists, that must be a God of the gaps reasoning. But apart from that, and I do think that we could look more at what he actually says to kind of, because he basically says God keeps on getting disproved, and well, dependent on where you are, you might believe in a different God. And he talks about India, the Hindus and Buddhists, and say, well, maybe the Buddhists don't believe in a divine nature order, which I do think is wrong from my interactions with a lot of Buddhists, and as quite an Asian Hong Kong kid, I do interact with quite a lot of Buddhists. There actually is quite a divine origin to Buddhism, and you might say, and although it's not creator God kind of thing, there's a concept called the Tao, which is the idea that, well, there's this divine path or this divine way in life, which all life is revolving around and evolving around this kind of universal way or universal form, which I think would be very far from a naturalistic explanation of the universe. So I do think that there has to be some caution here. And also, I think the God of the gaps argument, to take it back to that a bit, I think God of the gaps only works when you're talking, and I think IP talks about this a bit, is that God of the gaps only really works when you're talking about, well, naturalistic gods, in the sense that, or natural gods, like, oh, there's a God of thunder, a God of water, or something like that. Like, if you're going to look at things in the universe and say, well, that's a God of something, then maybe you could find a God of the gaps argument here. But then what about, you could turn it around and say, well, perhaps, or what do you think about things which you don't think exist, like meaning? Like in his first argument, he says, well, meaning doesn't really exist. Then when we attribute meaning to a God, in the sense that God provides us with meaning in life, well, where did you get the idea from? Surely we didn't see meaning in life to get God, because from his first argument, there is no meaning in the world. So it seems that from his own argument, it seems that not everything which we see in God is explained via what we see in the world. So I think there's some internal inconsistency. I wouldn't say contradiction, because I don't think it goes that far yet, but there's some inconsistency between his first and his second argument here. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I'm glad you hit on the point about like how God of the gaps is used, because it's something I've thought about. Because in like polytheistic religions, you have like the God of water, the God of thunder, and that's how you explain these things. But especially when you get into like the monotheistic tradition, like I think about reading in Exodus, like it's like, I think it's Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3:14, when it talks about like why God exists. It's not I exist because thunder exists or lightning exists. It says Yahweh says, I'm the self-existent one. So it seems like, at least in like the Christian or the Jewish tradition, God doesn't exist because of gaps in scientific knowledge or things that people 2,000 years ago didn't understand, but because he exists necessarily, which is the same thing we say now as theists. But the only other thing that I kind of got out of this, because it was just kind of like God of the gaps, which I understand where AP's coming from. Obviously, I disagree with it, but I understand it. Is he talked about that there's just nothing supernatural. There's just no examples of anything supernatural, which is interesting, because I have a hard time believing that. Obviously, we could go back to my debate with like Randolph Richardson, where I brought these studies up, where it's like, if God does not exist, how do we explain these seeming instances where prayer is actually effective in double-blind environments? But even like beyond that, those studies are just like hogwash. I think to say that 100 out of 100 times the explanation has always been natural, I don't think that's really true when you look at a lot of people's personal experience. Like if you think about it, there's probably like 4 or 5 billion theists in the world, a couple billion Christians, or at least professing Christians. And there was a study by Pew Forums, which showed in like 10 or 12 countries, it was like, I think it was like 10 or 15% of Christians claimed that they'd experienced a miracle, a supernatural event, and like 50% had like personal experiences with God. And I kind of think that it does a little bit of a disservice to just say that there's no examples of the supernatural, even though I don't really like that word, because so many people across all of time, in so many different diverse regions, have had these personal experiences or miracles. And it would seem like at least there's a lot of people who think that there's this supernatural realm. And I understand that it's personal testimony, but we can't just use AP's testimony and that just debunks all these Christians' testimony. At best, it's like 50-50, but then the plurality of Christians, I think actually would help their case. So I said a lot of words there, but what do you kind of think about like his argument that's just like there's just no evidence of the supernatural?
Okay. I think my mic kind of disconnected a few seconds ago, but I think it's back again working now.
I hear you.
Yeah. So I do think the distinction between supernatural and natural explanations is definitely quite an interesting one. And I did write that a bit. It's like, well, to what degree when he says, well, all supernatural things have been debunked 100 out of 100% or something like that. Mm-hmm. Number one, where on earth did he get that statistics? Did you go over every single miracle that has ever been recorded and say, well, I've gone to each one of them and did my suitable study, ticked off every single checklist in the history of the world and said, I've debunked every single one of them. But I mean, turning that aside, like to what degree, and I think here there's another point in his rebuttal or something like that, where he said, well, what evidence would I seem or deem it to be supernatural? And later on, he basically says, well, in order to see or believe in something supernatural, I will either see something coming out of absolutely nothing or a massive God coming from the sky or something like that. Mm-hmm. And while I might not be able to defend a massive God coming out of the sky, I think it's quite clear that there is good reason to believe that at one point something did come out of absolutely nothing. So I think a miracle on his standards did actually exist. So even on his own standard of what a miracle is and what would make him believe in God, I do think that there's actually good evidence to support one of his so-called things which will make me a theist thing. Because I mean, I don't want to go too much about the infinity, but it's quite clear that the actual infinity, or at least for me, that these concepts cannot be realized in reality, which point towards the finite space-time boundary to any or all physical matter which could have ever existed. So I think the idea of something coming out of nothing is nigh undeniable mathematically and philosophically. So even on his own degree of no supernatural things happened, it seems that mathematics points directly towards something which he claims as supernatural and a miracle. So it does seem that his idea of, well, miracles are wrong 100% of the time or have been disproven does not seem to be quite a strong argument, if you got what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's kind of an audacious claim, and I understand where he's coming from, but I don't think that it really works, especially you talked about him just not being, I don't think he's in a position to really make that claim with certainty. I think we talked about everything in this like second argument, like it was mostly like out of the gaps kind of, which is okay, and then there's just no evidence of like a supernatural realm or miracles or stuff. Is there anything else you kind of got out of this before we go to his third argument?
No, I think we've covered most of it.
Sounds good. And I thank you everyone who's been tuning in with us, Spartan Theology, Curity, Deconverted Man, my man Dan, London Theist, everyone else. And we're going to keep on going here with his third argument.
Believing in something makes life easier. It is hard for humans to accept the fact, the idea that life simply goes on without us, that after we die, we simply cease existing as we did not exist before we were born, and that people simply go on without us, that everything just goes on. It is hard to accept that goodness will remain unrewarded and evil will remain unpunished. We constantly think about why life is the way it is. We try to seek some pattern in everything, and we try to explain life as fair or unfair, when in reality, life is neither fair nor unfair. Life is simply life. There is no greater design, no structure to it. If we observe human history, we see that for everything, the cause and effects that happened in our life were natural, or we were the creator, the designer of those causes and effects. It was never God. In fact, even in Christian theology, this idea that that the things we are doing are for us, not for a God, evolved over time. Like Kierkegaard, for example, said that humans pray not to change the nature of God, or not to influence God, but to influence ourselves. And this keeps developing, the idea that we are not actually doing anything to God, but that we are simply doing this for ourselves. Believing and worshiping is easy because it takes off the burden of ourselves. It makes us focus on something outside of ourselves. It takes off your mind from yourself. What is interesting, however, is that psychology and neuroscience explains that religion is that religion can be psychologically and neuroscientifically explained. For example, famously, Andrew Newberg, who is a neuroscientist, works in neurotheology, and he has been observing Buddhists and nuns during their religious practices, and he observes that the Christian nuns in their meditation and the Buddhists in their meditation have the same brain activities. The same things are going on in their brain. And mind you, the nuns believe in the one God. Buddhists don't believe in a God or anything. They don't pray, they don't worship. They simply meditate and try to be a better version of themselves. Neuroscience also finds that psychedelic drugs have the same effect as religion. Drugs and sex have the same effect. Those things are just more tangible, which is why they're stronger, and it is more easier to be attached to them. But it is, of course, easier to explain religion from a morality aspect and to believe in that. So psychology acknowledges that religion, worship, makes us happier, that it makes life easier. But there are also alternatives to that, like meditation, yoga, different forms of activities that people do nowadays with which they find happiness in easier and more reasonable ways that we can actually explain, and without relying on ancient ideas of a divine. As a result, we see that there is no reason at all to believe in a God, because it is absurd by science, mathematically and historically improbable, and apparently only a human wish. And the only result I can have from this is that the idea of God can simply be dismissed without further question.
Right. Lots of great stuff here. What are your kind of initial thoughts, Josh, on his final argument?
Well, I think there's a few things we could discuss about first. First of all, it says believing in Christianity makes things easier. Like, I don't necessarily buy into that premise too much, because I think from personal experience and from discussion with my friends, becoming a Christian doesn't necessarily make your life easier per se. Like, it doesn't make your interactions with others easier. I mean, I live in I go to quite a secular school, so I'm literally surrounded by atheists, like literally that my entire existence. But like it doesn't necessarily make it easier for you, and like it makes you have more moral responsibility. There is you get to face, you sometimes will have to face persecution. There is more burden, and there are a lot of obligations which come along with being Christians. And if you ask me, do I think the reward at the end of the day is worth it? Definitely, I would say hands down, everything, all the pain in this world is all worth the relationship with God. I would definitely believe in that. But does it make life easier from perhaps an evolutionary standpoint? Does it make you live better or increase your chances of survival? Perhaps not. And does it make things easier for you? I wouldn't necessarily say so, but that is just the start of his argument. So if you don't have much to say about that, we could move on to the rest part of the argument. I just wanted to make a note.
Yeah. I mean, I think I understand where he's coming from, because I hear this a lot, that like religion just makes life easier. Like you have this comfort of an afterlife, and it just kind of makes you feel better that like you're not going to die. And I understand where he's coming from, but I disagree on a couple of things. I think it is kind of weird to think about that I'm going to live forever. Like, I don't think that, I think it's almost, it doesn't seem as weird to me that just like you just die one day. That's just my own personal kind of like beliefs on that topic. But obviously I do believe that I'm a Christian. I'm going to live forever. And that's weird to think about, but it's true. And what's true is more important than my thoughts about what is true. But besides for that, I think AP is an ex-Muslim. So he would know that like how hard it is to leave Islam. Like you can hear about people who lose everything when they leave Islam. And I think the same thing can be said about Christian converts to Islam. Like there's Christian converts who give up so much and they gain in this life so little for becoming a Christian over and leaving Islam. Like there is not for all, it's not like you just as a Christian just have this like easy life for the rest of your life. You have to deny yourself, you have to give away your money, you have to live unselfishly, like all these things. So I kind of disagree on that idea that being a Christian just makes things easier. But I'll let you kind of take it wherever you want now, Josh.
Yeah, and I guess the next thing he says is, and I guess we could build on upon that a bit more, I guess. I think I had something in my brain, but it just disappeared from my brain again, like in a few seconds. Okay, I think it is about Buddhists and nuns having meditations and having the same chemical impulse. Like, I think feelings here, I think IP also says that a bit when he says psychological reasons are different from metaphysical reasons. But also I think that feelings are very different from the truth, because, I mean, like, it might be that being nuns, being a Christian, and meditating sometimes feels the same. But there's also times where meditating and being a Christian feels very different, because I can tell you from personal experience, some of my, like, our school invited a yoga person to come into school, and that was before COVID and everything like that. So we had like this nun coming, this yoga master coming to school and had us to do meditations. Boy, we hated it with our guts so badly that I don't think praying would ever produce the same emotions of hate that we experienced on that day. So I do think that there's a very big difference, and I don't want to just straw man his entire argument, but just that things can lead to similar chemical impulses doesn't mean that their roots are the same, because a lot of things can lead to the same results. For example, believing that 1 + 1 + 1 = 3 is very different, would lead to the same result as 1 + 0.5 plus like some random 1,000, and then you change all that different mathematics and impose a new mathematical system and say that equals to 3. Maybe you do get the same results, but then one's clearly correct and one's wrong. So just that the result is correct doesn't mean that the process you get to it is correct, because sometimes, I'll do some maths for homework and then my answer is correct and the teacher still gives me 0 marks. My entire working is completely messed up, and it's an absolute miracle how I got the correct answer in the first place. And so like, just that someone can get the correct answer doesn't mean the results or what am I talking about? Just that someone can get the right outcomes doesn't mean that the process or the procedures to get to that outcome are correct or are all the same, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, I'm tracking with you. And I think your point is good. And there's one thing I'd add. I think IP gives this in his rebuttal. We're obviously not going to listen to what IP says. We listen to the full debate. But he talks about the idea of AP brings up that like Buddhists will have the same like brain activity as like a Christian during like some sort of like religious experience. And IP brings up the point, well, if we are made in the image of God and if we are made to like experience God, wouldn't that kind of be the case then, that like we all have this capacity to experience God? That kind of would explain like why the brains would be the same, or not the same, but in a similar like pattern as like a Christian or a Buddhist. And then you kind of use like an argument you just brought forth where like it doesn't mean that they're all right then, like that wouldn't follow. So I do think we could add that. And he talks about like you get the same experiences from like drugs and sex as you do like a religious experience. And I just don't know if that's true. I think a lot of people you look at like drug addiction or sex addiction, things like that, they destroy lives. At least in America, we all know people who either have passed away or are in very serious condition because of drug addiction. Like these things are very dangerous, can have very like life-threatening long-term consequences. Whereas with like a proper religious belief, I don't think you're going to have that same idea unless you adopt like some sort of like very radical form of Islam or something like that. So a couple of interesting points there. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I think your drug addiction and sex addiction thing is quite a good thing. It just reminded me of something, because imagine that drugs and sex do have the same effect. Doesn't mean drugs and sex are the same thing either. Like it's a very different thing. And also, he also says, I think, that prayer, it does not do anything to God, but it's a way to affect ourselves. Yeah. But I fail to see how that's an argument against Christianity, because I don't think anyone's ever said, by praying, we're going to change God's personality or change what God's going to do. Like God's going to do what God's going to do. And it's something that Putin himself, Vladimir Putin, you wouldn't expect me to say this, but he actually provides a theodicy quite recently where he says, well, God's love to us is not via necessarily granting all our wishes, but God's love to us is allowing us to pray to him and giving us the hope in ourselves to continue striving towards the eternal relationship that by being Christians, that we are part of this eternal relationship and community with him. So I think prayer in the same way does not need to be God granting us things, because I think that's a way that those prosperity gospels seem to twist Christianity to say, well, you're going to change God by being a good Christian, and God's going to grant you with thousands of dollars. You're going to have a mega yacht. You're going to be rich and everything. You're going to have mansions and stuff like that. No, I think being a Christian is that spiritual support, that spiritual relationship with God, and that develops and grows throughout your life. And it's not a physical thing that you're talking about. It's not a state of affairs, but it's a state of mind. And I'm not saying that God doesn't exist and I'm going full on like Zen here, but what I'm trying to say is that even if we don't change God with our prayers, it doesn't mean that God isn't working with our lives, and that by allowing us to pray to him, we become better human beings and grow in confidence with him. So I fail to see how that argument does interact or argue against Christianity in any sense of the word Christian that we use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think that it's a really interesting, like, total case that AP brings up. So just we'll kind of like summarize here because we've gotten through his opening statement. Like, I really appreciated his arguments because it's not just like the very basic stuff that I'll hear all the time where it's like, oh, you can't prove that God doesn't exist or that God exists and da 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 da. It's a very like nuanced attempt at just like looking at these different things like chaos or God of the gap, like the psychology of religion, and trying to say like what just better explains the data. And if you're listening to this, AP, it's really enjoyable. Obviously, we disagree on a lot, but I think there's a lot of really good, interesting points. And I'd love to see AP engage more with like theistic philosophy and stuff more, because I think he's a very smart guy, and I think that his views may change over time because there's some things that he gets right, but I also think there's some things where he's probably wrong on. It'd be interesting to see kind of like where this takes him. I'm like, what are your kind of like final thoughts on this kind of like this whole opening statement in this debate, Josh?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It is a very interesting approach, and it's a nice one. It's a really interesting. It's a helpful one to kind of test us against different arguments as well, because I'm pretty sure that like most of us wasn't expecting AP to raise these arguments, but he did, and I think they are quite an interesting way and an interesting approach to atheism, or whatever he wants to call himself. I remember he didn't really want himself to be called Apostate Prophet either. So I mean, like I think that the most important thing here with his discussion here is that it is an interesting point of view. These are three rather new or lesser approach arguments, although I say his first one's quite similar to what Nietzsche argues for. But I mean, apart from that, I think most of this is indeed a very interesting thing, and I completely agree with what you say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we're going to start to wrap this up now. I do want to say before we wrap things up, encourage everyone to subscribe to Josh's channel, Apologetics, for all it's linked down below. You're doing all sorts of like crazy stuff with infinity and stuff right now. So just talk about like what's going on with your channel, because I'm curious. You're like getting into like crazy stuff. So yeah.
I started off the channel with doing a series on the resurrection, but then that didn't go too well. I didn't like the quality of that, so I took that all off the channel. And then I did one on theodicies and problems of evil. And after that, I've now turned to the infinity, because over Christmas I was just reading through infinity, set theory, and everything like that. Because one of my teachers at school said, well, maybe set theory defeats this premise 2 of the Kalam by saying, well, there exists an infinite set. So I was like, all right, let me do some research on set theory. So basically, my current series on infinity is basically me doing live streams on the infinity, where I discuss what set theory is, what infinity is. Then I discuss some paradoxes of the infinity. This Friday, I'm going to discuss, well, what are some conceptual arguments against infinity? And well, why are these paradoxes so paradoxical? And then finally, I'll discuss some implications on science, on philosophy, on modality, and things like that in my last live stream. And I basically use these live streams as connect with the community things. So the actual content that I deliver is normally 40 minutes, and I stay for another like hour or two just answering random questions about it and about my life. So that's basically my infinity series. I'm also doing a verse of the day series, where I basically discuss a Bible verse and discuss a bit of Dostoevsky in each of these videos. I basically take my camera, go out, walk around Hong Kong, show you around like some interesting places that you normally don't see if you're overseas or you don't visit Hong Kong too much. I basically walk around these nice kind of scenic places around Hong Kong and basically try to show what Hong Kong is, and also allow you, more specifically aimed at Christians, to interact with God's word, because it's very easy for us to focus on philosophy, but not really focus or think about our relationship with God. So it's kind of a balance on the channel here. So that's kind of the two main things I'm working on my channel right now. Yeah.
Definitely, man. And I'm going to definitely have to have you on. Thank you. Jesus also said, bring him in more often. We've got to bring in the Josh Yen. And we'll have you on again, I'm sure, to talk about maybe like evil or the Kalam or all kinds of stuff. But thank you so much for joining me, Josh, to review this debate. I encourage everyone to subscribe to that channel. I thank everyone for tuning in. Deconverted Man, thank you, Jesus. The London Theist, QRT, everyone else. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Apostate Prophet, if you listen to this, hope you found this edifying. I hope you found our criticisms edifying. You did a lot of great great stuff. Feel free to reach out to me, or I'm sure you can reach out to Josh too, and I'd love to work through some of the things we talked about. And if you're new to Adherent Apologetics, I encourage you to subscribe. If you subscribe to Josh's channel, Apologetics for All, be sure to subscribe here, leave a like. You can leave a review. And then if you enjoy the show, you can support us on Patreon. I'm so blessed for everyone's support, like 83% funded. So if you want to do that, you can support on patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics. But Josh, thank you so much again. It's been so much fun.
No worries. Glad to be here anytime.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. God